In this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast, which is telling you the accumulation of lactate into the blood, but it's not telling us anything about how much lactate is being produced and how much lactate is being consumed. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by Dave Schell, founder and head coach of Kaizen Endurance, for another episode of Fast Physiology, where we do a succinct dive into a single endurance topic. In today's episode, we're going to explore the question, where does lactate come from, and does it really cause fatigue? Enjoy. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Dr. Phil, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course, man. These are, so anybody who doesn't know, Dave and I record, every Tuesday, and it's one of those things where I always look forward to talking to Dave, and it always starts on Monday being like, oh crap, what sort of topic should we talk about? And then I text him and I'm like, hey, these are the topics that I'm interested in. And he's like, dude, we already did those. So eventually we figure out a good topic for everybody. And today the topic is lactate. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of, sort of myths around lactate. And I just wanted to kind of, have a 20-minute episode ironing most of that out. I don't think we can actually get to everything in 20 minutes. Yeah. But I do think it'll be a really, really good starting point and a really, really good learning opportunity for everybody to get my perspective on lactate coming from the physiology side of things, and then Dave's perspective on lactate coming from the coaching side of things. And Dave, if you wouldn't mind just starting, what's your experience, with lactate, and are there any things that you hear consistently from athletes in regard to lactate that, we might need to bust in terms of myths today?
So I guess I'll start with my experience with lactate. And so it's something we've always talked about in coaching. It's something we read about. We talk about lactate threshold and like all these things. I didn't actually have firsthand experience with it until last year, I think. I got my first lactate meter and started testing it on myself. And I think over that time, it really changed the way that I thought about it, and also how I thought about thresholds. So if we talk about FTP or something like that, and I just realized that it's such a gray area, and the way that lactate behaves, and like so much is open for interpretation and things like that, and I'm sure we'll get into that. It just kind of opened my eyes to like, everybody wants this like very black and white number, so we can say, oh, my threshold is this down to the watt. And so we think that the lab is going to give us that precision that we're looking for. And what I learned is like, nope, still pretty gray. Like it's still like a 10 to 20 watt, area that we're operating in. As far as athletes and the things that I've heard, I think just in general, and we can talk about these things, but I think like some of the things historically is very fixed levels of lactate meaning certain things. So like 2 millimolar or 4 millimolar being your threshold, lactate causing fatigue. And that's one like I used to hear a lot when I first started coaching, and I don't know if people have become more educated or if we've just moved on from lactate and are more focused on like the power stuff or what, but I don't hear that as much. But I think now's a perfect time to talk about it because it's starting to become on vogue again. So
yeah, most of you, if you don't live under a rock, have probably seen people from Peter Attia's podcast talking about lactate and talking about continuous lactate meters and how those would really change the future of cycling especially, and both running and cycling have really adopted lactate, at least the coaches who are interested in looking at internal physiological variables. And I do think that there is a lot of value in measuring lactate. I will say that it requires you to learn a lot about your physiology, and that's kind of what I was getting from you, Dave, when you were starting to say, oh yeah, I started to measure my lactate, and it was like, changing all the time, and my, you know, thresholds were different on a day-to-day basis. And it really, if you're truly becoming a little bit more of a, like, trying to learn from the value from lactate that you're taking, you start to hone in on, oh, well, you know, I'm very hydrated today and my lactate levels are staying a little bit lower.
Yeah.
I ate a little bit less carbohydrates and my lactate levels are staying a little bit lower. Ooh, I didn't recover well enough and my lactate levels are staying a little bit lower, right? There's all these different factors that could affect how lactate is actually being produced. And I think that is one of the main benefits of, you know, using any sort of internal physiological variable, whether it be lactate, muscle oxygenation, even VO2, if you're measuring it on a regular basis. It gives you an idea of what's actually happening under the hood. It's kind of like, you know, the difference between understanding how your car engine works and just expecting or just hoping that it, you know, lasts from one oil change to the next. You know, once you start to actually like dig in, look at the oil on a day-to-day basis, look at, you know, how the different systems are working together, other things like that. It just gives you a bigger picture and then gives you a little bit better idea of what's actually happening. So before we answer the questions of, like, you know, the fixed lactate numbers and does it cause fatigue and other things like that, I just want to take a step back and dive kind of deep into the physiology of where does lactate come from. And this is something that I think is important because when we measure lactate, we measure it in, you know, from a finger prick or an earlobe prick generally. That's coming from circulating blood. But your blood is not making the lactate. Your blood is just giving you a concentration of lactate that is circulating within it. And from there, what's really happening is your muscle is what is creating lactate. So when you exercise, you break down fats and you break down carbohydrates, and that allows you to make energy for muscular contraction. The higher the intensity of contraction, the more you lean on carbohydrates to actually make that energy for contraction to continue to occur. What happens, though, is that when your carbohydrate breakdown outstrips the rate at which you can use oxygen in your mitochondria, you actually start to build up the end product of carbohydrate breakdown, which is pyruvate. Pyruvate can either be taken up into the mitochondria. So if we have adequate oxygen on board, it can be taken up into the mitochondria, and then it can be further oxidized and used for energy within the mitochondria. Once we outstrip, once we start to maximize the amount of oxygen we can actually use, then we get more pyruvate that is building up because carbohydrates are still being broken down. They can't be taken up into the mitochondria anymore, so they have to be converted into something else. That something else is lactate. And when you convert pyruvate to lactate, there's a couple things that happen. First of all, you take two hydrogens out of the system and put them onto lactate. And the reason I want to make this distinction is because a lot of the times we say, oh, lactate causes fatigue. Well, just from that perspective, and hydrogens are really the ones that are making your muscle milieu more acidic, which is then causing fatigue. So from that perspective, lactate actually buffers a fatigue-causing or a fatigue-related mechanism. And then on top of it, it also replenishes this molecule called NAD. NAD is required for glycolysis to continue to occur because at one point it actually takes a hydrogen from the glycolysis pathway and allows for the breakdown of glucose to continue to occur. So as long as we're maintaining our NAD pools so they can take more of those hydrogens, then we are able to continue to do glycolysis. So lactate actually is acting in a beneficial fashion to keep glycolysis going and buffer a very, very small proportion of the hydrogens that are being created during exercise. So what then happens to that lactate? Because we have different muscle cells or muscle fibers. We have our type 1, which are slow twitch fibers, and our type 2, which are fast twitch fibers. Our fast twitch fibers are more reliant on carbohydrate breakdown. So presumably they're going to be burning more carbohydrates, not have enough mitochondria to uptake that pyruvate, and be making more lactate. So the first step is that lactate gets shipped out of the muscle cell. And the closest thing around those other muscle cells are more muscle cells, right? And you could have a slow twitch fiber that's really, really good at using oxygen to make energy. So it could take that lactate molecule up, it can convert it back to pyruvate, and then it can oxidize it within the mitochondria to make energy. So that would be the first step. So at low intensities, once lactate starts getting shipped kind of out of the muscle cell, it just gets picked up by another muscle cell, and we don't see hardly any rise in our lactate at low intensities.
And I think you should specify that, because I think that might be something that people don't really know or understand, is that we're always producing lactate. There's always some amount of lactate in our blood.
Yep. So there's always some amount of lactate that is eventually leaking out of the entire system. But in the beginning, it's not that much. It's 1 millimolar, 1.5 millimolar, something along those lines, unless you ate a really high carbohydrate meal beforehand, and then it's, could be all over the board. So at really low intensities, you're essentially taking all that lactate up into your slow twitch fibers, converting it back to pyruvate, and then oxidizing it in the mitochondria. As you exercise more and more intensely, more pyruvate is being created, more lactate is then being shipped out of those type 2 fibers, and eventually it hypersaturates the type 1 fibers. So then we get even more leak. So then we get lactate coming out of those type 1 fibers, and then they're going into the capillaries. Those capillaries eventually lead into the veins, and then the veins, get recycled into arterial blood, and that's where we start to see lactate levels start to rise with higher exercise intensity. So lactate is coming from the muscle, and specifically, it's most likely it's being created by all muscle tissue at all times. The question is just where does it get picked up, and how much leakage or how much outspill do we get into the blood? And when, like the whole point of measuring your first and second threshold is to see when and where those changes in flux of lactate into the blood are occurring. So first threshold is that first rise. Second threshold is that exponential rise that I think I've heard quite a bit where people are like, oh man, my legs are burning so bad from the lactic acid buildup, right? Because there's an association between increases in lactate and fatigue, even though lactate is not actually causing fatigue. And we're going to make another episode on fatigue, so we won't dive into that right now.
So I think another interesting thing, and this is something that I learned last year when I was playing with it, is you start off at a very easy intensity during your warm-up or whatever, and let's say it's 1 millimolar. But as you warm up, you might actually see that decrease a little bit, and then kind of come back up. So what happens there? Like, is it the muscle fibers becoming more active, more oxygenated, and like taking up that fuel, or what's going on there?
So I think what's happening is in the beginning, when you first start to exercise, the stress of exercise is so low compared to everything else that's happening in the body, like digestion and other bodily processes, that most likely you're going to get a higher level of lactate, because you're not actually taking that lactate up into your muscle, because your muscle just isn't active, right? So from digestion of carbohydrates, you're actually producing lactate, and then lactate is circulating around the system, waiting to be uptaken by the brain, the heart, the muscles, those sort of things. If your muscles aren't contracting, then you're not using much lactate. You're not trying to make more energy. But as you start to exercise, the exercise stress starts to supersede everything else, all of those resting metabolic functions, and then you start to see that dip in lactate, because your body actually starts to preferentially uptake that lactate to make into energy within the mitochondria very, very quickly.
Okay. And so I think the other thing that maybe this isn't a myth or whatever, but it's like a misnomer, that I think a lot of times people think lactate is the enemy.
Yeah.
yeah, it's the bad thing or whatever, and like so the goal should be to produce less of it and things like that. But my understanding, it's a fuel that's used by some of our organs and other tissues, right?
Yeah, it depends who you talk to in the research community, but there are some people who have made their careers on studying lactate who say that lactate is actually the preferred fuel of the body of every tissue. Um,
Interesting.
that's obviously like, to the nth degree, but I certainly believe that, lactate is something that is very, very important because if you think back to where is lactate being produced and the function that lactate has, when it's converted from pyruvate to lactate and it's buffering those hydrogens and creating more NAD, it's actually keeping glycolysis going. So if we stopped the production of lactate completely, we would only be able to do like a couple rounds of glycolysis and then we'd be SOL. So from that perspective, lactate is super beneficial. And I will say too, if you want to lower your lactate levels, just go on a calorie deficit and go on a really low carbohydrate diet for a few days, and you will see your lactate levels be super, super, super low.
And I would imagine that performance would follow that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. High intensity performance is going to diminish. I mean, you see it time and time again with people who switch from, high carbohydrate to higher fat diets, especially in the acute stages. So, like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on how long it takes to adapt, to switching over fuel sources. But yeah, absolutely. I had somebody reach out to me and they were like, yeah, I did a lactate test and my lactate never got over 4 millimole. So the person was telling me I didn't have a second threshold. And I was like, well, did you have to stop because you were tired? And they were like, yes, I had to stop because I was tired. I was like, okay, well, obviously you were above your second threshold. And this is a good juxtaposition into like, absolute values of lactate. A lot of the times we see, first threshold is around 2 millimolar, second threshold is 4 millimolar. And I've had some really, really smart people reach out to me on my Instagram, and they're like, hey, this is where the 4 millimolar, idea comes from. And it was a paper, I believe that was, published in 1974 by this German researcher who, super smart guy. But what they found was that in like a group of trained individuals, that the accumulation of fatigue or their ability to maintain exercise intensity precipitously dropped at or after 4 millimole. So then we started to get this idea that, 4 millimole is really the, the number that, you don't want to go over. And since then, if you look in the literature, if you look at like reviews of like how many different ways of determining, like second threshold based on lactate,
Right.
There's like 21. Like, I'm not even joking. It's like actually like 21 different ways of determining your second threshold. And it's like maximal lactate, steady state, 4 millimolar of lactate, the second inflection point, in, the accumulation of lactate into the blood. And it gets challenging because that makes it more confusing for people, right? There's not one way to interpret these numbers, but I always default to something that is looking at trends in a number rather than having a strict cutoff, say, of 4 millimolar or 2 millimolar. That's where a little bit of confusion lies, and that individual perfectly highlights this idea that 4 millimolar isn't the end all be all for everybody, because her lactate didn't get over 3.
Yeah, and I'd like in my experience when I was playing with it myself, I mean, I think I was getting up to like 7 or something crazy. It's like getting pretty high. And there was another time where I'd eaten a big bowl of oatmeal like 30 minutes before, and just my resting levels were way higher than typical.
Yeah.
And so I just like had to throw out everything. Like I stopped doing it because it was like pointless at that point, So how about some of the things I've heard, if we're talking about like misconceptions or whatever, is like I've heard a lot of workouts like, lactate buffering, lactate tolerance, lactate shuttle. So I guess from my position, it seems like now like lactate buffering and lactate tolerance aren't really like, that's not what we're trying to do. Lactate shuttle seems to be more of a more recent idea. So like, what are your thoughts with those types of workouts and, treating it like this thing that has to be dealt with?
I mean, I think sometimes what we try to do as like coaches is we try to make something fairly straightforward sound a little bit more complicated to make it fit into a narrative that, I came up with something brand new and different. It's, are you developing your mitochondria to the point to be able to uptake and utilize more lactate or use more oxygen? Because ultimately that's what it comes down to, is if you can use more oxygen, then presumably you'll be able to use more pyruvate, so then it doesn't become lactate so you don't get accumulations of lactate into the blood until later on. So that would be the idea, right? Really, it's fatigue tolerance. It's you're teaching your body by exercise, because most of these training sessions are pretty close to that, that second threshold, that tipping point between sustainable and unsustainable. And the more time you can accumulate there, the better off your body is going to get at seeing a flood of metabolites like hydrogens, inorganic phosphates, the secondarily connected lactate molecule, and it's going to adapt to be more fatigue resistant at that intensity. So you're pushing up your body's ability to buffer those fatigue-related metabolites. And one of the consequences, or one of the benefits of that, is that you don't accumulate as much fatigue into your blood, because your body is just able to use more oxygen and then derive more of its energy production from oxygen-related ATP production. So I think I think it's a fancy way of just saying like, okay, we're going to work on fatigue tolerance at higher intensities today.
Well, and I think the other thing, and like, I've kind of heard this before, and like hearing you talk about it too, it sounds like the same thing, where it's like, really, if you want to, and I'm just going to use these words again because they're common words. If you want to increase your lactate tolerance or buffering capabilities, things like that, it comes down to the mitochondria and training those slow twitch fibers to better uptake, use more oxygen, stuff like that. And so it's not all the intervals right at that second threshold. It's also a lot of that base work that's going to improve that.
Yeah, because if you think about what that volume has a tendency to do is stimulate oxygen delivery. So capillary density is stimulated through that, which is going to allow for more oxygen to be delivered. Mitochondria are going to get larger. So then presumably there should be more energy production for smaller changes. It makes your mitochondria more sensitive to changes in energy needs. So yeah, you absolutely need both, and you'll never. I think there will never be a day where somebody comes to me and is like, "What sort of exercise should I be doing?" And I don't give them easy work to build volume and then higher intensity work to allow for mitochondrial function to be better.
Right.
And when I say mitochondrial function, it's the amount of oxygen that can be used per unit size of the mitochondria. So it's essentially like if you liken it to building a house. Zone 2 is going to add additions to your house. It's going to increase the square footage, and high intensity work is going to put in better appliances. It's going to put in more doors for better access. It's going to put in more windows for more sunlight. It's going to do all these things that make whatever square footage you have more functional and just working better. So you need both. You absolutely need both. And anybody who tells you to do one thing or the other, run away, because it's not going to benefit you fully in the long run.
Okay, so a parting thought here, or a parting question that might get us for another 20 minutes. The Norwegian method has been like pretty popular as of late, and I think one of the hallmarks of that is that they do these intervals, but they have a certain cutoff, and I want to say it's 3 millimolar, and it
depends what workout you're doing.
Right. So yeah, so that's what I'd like you to speak on, is like, one, where are they coming up with that, and what is the thought process behind it?
I wish I knew. So one of the workouts, they what they're trying to do is they're trying to accumulate volume at speeds that they're going to be racing at.
Okay.
And if you listen to the Peter Attia podcast with Olav, he's part of that Norwegian group that's kind of using science to better performance. And what he was talking about is that the accumulation of time at intensity, especially for your quality, your interval sessions, is going to be the single best predictor of performance. So what we're referring to in the Norwegian method is the Ingebrigtsen brothers and how they do interval training, and it's typically 2 sessions, one in the morning and one at night. One of the sessions is a little bit longer intervals. The second session is a little bit shorter intervals. The longer intervals, they don't allow for, lactate to go above, I think, like 2.5, and then the other one, it's like 3.5.
Okay.
But the whole point is that they're trying to accumulate as much time at race pace as they possibly can, and by limiting the amount of internal stress that happens, the amount of lactate that can accumulate, they're able to balance that knife edge a little bit better of, over fatiguing and over, essentially overtraining or overreaching with actual usable adaptive signals that are happening with that. Now, I would hope that that 2.5 and that 3.5 is coming somewhere from, they did tests
right,
where it said, individual tests,
right.
exactly. And it's just been bastardized and simplified as
right.
it's been kind of passed down in the telephone sense. No, but there is no magic to 2.5. There's no magic to 3.5. It has to be individual if you're going to try to accumulate the right amount of internal stress for you. And that's going to change on any given day because it could be hot. You could be dehydrated. You could have a lot of carbohydrates, on board. You could have drank way more coffee, one day to the next, right? There's all these different things that are going to affect the accumulation and the use of lactate within your, during your exercise. So, don't use specific numbers, but it could be useful to start to get an idea of, whenever I exercise above 300 watts, my lactate precipitously climbs. Whether that inflection point is at 4, 5, 6, 3.5, 2.75 doesn't really matter. It just matters that you found that exercise intensity where lactate goes from a seeming steady state to something that just keeps increasing. So look at the trends in the lactate and the data rather than just the specific number.
And I almost feel, and this is like, I think it gives them an objective measure that they can use to keep them honest.
Mm-hmm.
But I almost feel like if you were really paying attention, and let's say we normalize for weather and for temperature, but you'd probably see the same thing in heart rate, where at a certain point, like if the heart rate's hitting steady or staying steady, and then all of a sudden it starts to climb up, and it's like higher than it was in the first, 4 or 5 reps, then like that's also an indication that you're like going over the edge there. But
yeah, you're falling apart, right? Your body is no longer able to reestablish some level of steady state. So, that's probably the point where you need to call it a day.
Yeah. So what are your takeaways for lactate?
My takeaways is that lactate isn't the enemy.
Please take lactate away.
Yeah. No, lactate is not the enemy. It's something that is beneficial, at least from a physiological standpoint. I think that it's a lot more complicated than a lot of folks lead on. And in order to really understand what's going on physiologically, you have to measure lactate or really any internal variable on a very repeated basis with controls and certain manipulations of different variables. Yeah,
and I think my takeaway would be that it's messy. It's kind of
literally
a pain. Yeah, it is. I sent you a time lapse of me doing a lactate test one day, and it was just like lancets everywhere and bloody tissues everywhere and stuff like that. And a lot of times you don't get a good sample because you're not bleeding enough. And for me, like the juice isn't worth the squeeze. I mean, I have it now and I'll continue to play with it, but I think in order for it to be really meaningful, you just have to be so repeatable with your process. Like do the same process every time in a controlled environment, and that's going to be hard for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, again, I'll end it on a positive note. I do think that lactate can teach you a lot if you're willing to learn and if you're willing to try to understand exactly what the measurement is telling you, which is telling you the accumulation of lactate into the blood, but it's not telling us anything about how much lactate is being produced and how much lactate is being consumed. So you have to take every measurement with what it actually is and try not to extrapolate too much, because that's where I think people start to get into trouble.
Yep, absolutely. Perfect.
Cool. Well, this is another fun episode of Fast Physiology. You can find Dave at Kaizen Endurance on Instagram. Feel free to reach out to him for questions. You can always reach out to me at Critical02 on Instagram. You can comment down below if you're on YouTube, and you can leave us comments and stuff on Spotify as well. I can't respond to those comments on Spotify, but we will take them into account, and we will try to make the podcast better based on your feedback. So we really appreciate you guys listening, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.